show today is about the man that you see a picture of right now. You're going to recognize him. But I guess that this show is more specifically about the last train ride that this humble and great leader would ever take. The state of Indiana played a very prominent role when the Lincoln funeral train came through this great state in April of 1865. Glad to have you along with us. This is the Indiana History Project. I'm your host, Norm Taylor. I'm with two very special people that have been friends of mine for a few years now. I have the Gosserts, Jim and Diana Gossert. Jim, it's good to have you here, my friend.
Glad to be here.
Came all the way from Indianapolis to be with us today and to do what I believe will be two very special shows that on the subject of the Lincoln funeral train. Diana, it's good to have you as well.
Thank you.
You know, and today I use their names because I would just kind of be going in between. They actually do the first person impressions of Mr. and Mrs. Oliver P. Morton. And Jim, I guess before we get into the funeral train a little bit more, I guess how many years have you actually been portraying Oliver Morton?
I've been portraying Governor Morton for about 10 years now.
We have about 10 years. Was there anything in particular that made you start to get interested in the great Union governor?
I used to be artillery reenactor. Due to job concerns and other things, I was basically forced to get out of the actual artillery union. So Diane and I both become interested. After we got married, she became interested in Civil War reenacting. So we started doing civilian.
So she was the first to get interested in Civil War reenacting?
Well, she knew that I had been doing it, and she got interested as a sidelight from that. And it just so happened that we were downtown for the 100th anniversary of the Sailor and Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And while going around the circle, it was noted that I looked quite a bit like Governor Morton from his statue, and it was suggested that instead of just being a civilian, why did not I interpret the governor? So
and we got
that's how we got started.
Well, we got a picture of Governor Morton that we'll show the people, because, you know, a lot of people, Jim, they're not familiar with Governor Morton, and but he, to me, and I guess I'm a little prejudiced since I'm from Indiana, but to me, he was the greatest of the governors that participated in for the Union cause.
I believe he was really a just governor for that situation. Very good friend of Abraham Lincoln to start with, very good supporter of Abraham Lincoln, and a big supporter of the troops. He made sure that the Indiana troops got what they needed and got it as soon as can be, and he stood up for the troops, and not only the troops, but also the orphans and the widows of those boys who gave their lives for the Union cause.
Yeah, I believe I read somewhere where Governor Oliver P. Morton was known as the soldier's friend or something. What was that? They made reference, soldier's friend or something like that.
Yes, he was the soldier's friend governor. Even the soldiers themselves would talk about it in camp of that. They say, boy, those Indiana boys are being kept well by their governor. Even the other states would notice how the governor kept the Indiana boys in supplies, because it was necessary for they are Indiana regiments. Therefore, they're not only supported by the federal government, they were also needed to be supported by the state governments.
Jim, I'm going to come back to you in just a few moments, because I want to make sure that we talk more about Oliver Morton, because he was an interesting figure to me, even though that when you start to do research on him, there's very little out there on him, but yet he was a very important part of the win for in the Civil War for the Union, in my view. Diana, you know, did you become interested then in Mrs. Morton because Jim was playing Oliver Morton?
Yes.
That's how you got to start to study up on it. And I'm going to assume that since there's not a whole lot on Governor Morton, that there's probably even less on his wife. Is that correct?
The only information I've been able to find on Lucinda Morton was in the footnotes of the biography of Governor Morton, which is just about 10 small footnotes. And
that's all? That's
all. I can't find hardly anything on her at all.
Do you know where she was from, where she was born, raised, anything at all like that?
She was born in Centerville.
In Centerville, okay, yeah. And so she was from a prominent family, from a just
Yes,
do
and
you know anything about that?
Her brother went to college with Oliver, and her brother's the one that introduced them.
Yeah.
And they got together that way. But her father was very prominent in Centerville.
You know, a lot of times in the Civil War, with any part of history, you know, it seems to have been in the past have been a concentration on the men part, or the male part of history, and yet they had wives, they had those people, they had mothers, they had people that played very prominent roles, and it was extremely important. But they seem to the stories of the women of the Civil War, they're exceptions, Clara Barton, and we could go on there, but yet the role that these women played in the Civil War, and especially that would have played being the wife of Governor Morton, I mean, that's an important element that just kind of has been left behind.
Well, Lucinda was a very strong person that formed a lot of committees that did a lot of the sewing, the knitting, the making of uniforms and stuff for the troops for the governor. She organized the ladies. But she also, before Mr. Stanton took over as over the the prisoner of war camps, she was one of the main people that made sure that those prisoners were fed, medical supplies, bedding, they were taken care of very well until he came in and told her she couldn't do it anymore.
Well, you know, I think I'm glad that you're doing this impression because, again, part of what we do on this program is we want to preserve history. And again, if people haven't heard of the great Governor Oliver Morton, they certainly haven't heard of his wife, Lucinda. So it is a great service that you're doing there, Diana. Thank you for that. Jim, back to Governor Morton. Now, again, a lot of people, they don't even know, this may be the first time they've ever even heard of Governor Morton. So can you give us a little bit of background you have about the military part, but he was a friend, he was a good friend of Abraham Lincoln, wasn't he?
That's correct. Just to give you some background, Governor Morton is the first governor in Indiana to have been born in Indiana. He was born in Wayne County in 1823. So he was actually a Hoosier to start with. Everybody else previous to this had been born in another state.
That's interesting.
He's the first Republican governor. He had been a Democrat, but he could not side with the Douglas Democrats in the early 1850s. He temporarily tried the Know Nothing Party, but that didn't satisfy him either. At this time, he met a group of upstarts who were forming their own party, basically men like Abraham Lincoln and a group of other people, including Stanton and Seward and a whole group of other men. And they were forming what they called the Republican Party. Now, Indiana still recognized the Democratic Party as the Democratic Republicans. So to separate ourselves in Indiana, we were called the Popular Party until 1856. When the National Republican Party was decided to be called the Republicans.
Well, if we use that term today, Democratic Republicans, in this election year, it would really get the people going. If people want to be, you know, right on one side or the other, but a combination of the two wouldn't work today.
And so he was a very good friend with Abraham Lincoln. He and Lincoln had basically the same what we call the strong three parts of the Republican Party. Most people know about part number one, which was no slavery being spread into the territories. They don't know that the Republican Party also wanted a spread of the railroad system. And Governor Morton felt that was very important for Indiana that we get more railroads here. And the number three part was Homestead Act. Governor Morton and Abraham Lincoln both thought it was very important that the areas be settled by people, normal, everyday people, who couldn't afford to buy the land, but who would be willing to work the land to own it. And the governor was very strong in that area. So the Homestead Act, which was also passed by the Republicans by Abraham Lincoln's administration, and the Railroad Act were both very important things to the governor.
Now, did Morton ever meet Lincoln before Lincoln was president?
Yes. Yes, like I said, he helped to form the party. He met
so they did meet.
And he was also very prominent in the nomination of Lincoln for the nomination for president. When a lot of people don't know that the Republican Party ticket was pretty much split, and they were having trouble deciding who to nominate in 1860, and Morton was very strong to get Abraham Lincoln to be nominated.
So now, whenever they got into the war years, then this friendship really paid its dividends on how that Governor Morton was able to mobilize the resources and the men in the state and so forth. So invaluable cause for Lincoln.
Yes, he made at least 4 trips, according to what I have found out through my information. He made at least 4 trips to Washington to confer with Lincoln, about 1 a year during the war period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they were very close, and that's a great working relationship there. After the war, then, what happened with Governor Morton?
Governor Morton became a senator in 1867. He became what is known as a radical Republican. He wasn't a radical Republican at first, but as we're going to be talking about the funeral, he became a radical Republican when his friend was assassinated by a Southerner, and he believed that it couldn't have been just an actor or a small group of people. It had to have been employed by the Southern Confederacy to assassinate his friend and president.
So he would have gone with the conspiracy theory then, huh?
Yes. Mm-hmm. As most of the radical Republicans did at that time, including Secretary of War Stanton, who looked as hard as he could to prove that Jefferson Davis, had something to do with it. They never could prove that, but he was they just couldn't understand how one lone actor with a group of cronies were able to pull that off.
So as Governor Morton and also as Jim Gossert, then what do you think? Do you think he acted alone, or do you think that there was that conspiracy with the Confederate government?
From what I have gathered through my knowledge, I believe he acted alone. I think he was a soul-driven person that hated Lincoln completely, hated what Lincoln stood for, hated with the idea that free slaves were going to be given citizenship. And I think he just went off the edge and decided he was going. I think he thought he was going to be a martyr, a great person. I don't mean a martyr, a great person. He was going to. You have to remember he was an actor, and he had done Julius Caesar many times. And I think he saw himself as Crassus or somebody like that in Julius Caesar, the one that after the assassination was going to be held, as a great person for what he had done.
It seemed to me that all the readings of Booth that I've ever read is that he certainly enjoyed the limelight. So this would fit in with what you're saying, is that whether it's off or on a stage, he wanted to be like Theodore Roosevelt said, kind of the corpse at every funeral. They talked about Theodore Roosevelt in that way. So Morton then enjoyed a political life after he was governor of the state during that time and later on, and I understand that he died a few years after the Civil War. You were talking about he was heading for Alaska.
In 1877, he was asked to do 2 things, to go, first of all, to Oregon, to look into a fraud case that was going on in Oregon that was involving the federal government. And then from there he was supposed to go to the territory of Alaska to give his opinion. He got as far as Oregon when he had a debilitating stroke, returned back to Indiana where he died within a few weeks.
So he's buried he's buried at Crown Hill Cemetery in Annapolis.
That is correct.
And I guess have you ever been to his gravesite?
Not recently.
Yeah, okay. And that's a great historic walk for you folks that ever get a chance to get up in Annapolis. If you want to go to Crown Hill Cemetery, I mean, the well-known people that are buried there and the unique monuments there and so forth, that's really a walk back in history with that in itself. Jim, we're here to talk about the Lincoln funeral train, and to me, in April of 1865, it was one of the most fascinating months in our history. I mean, we could talk all day just on the month of April in itself. We see the war starting to wrap up, the surrender of Lee of his troops in the Army of Northern Virginia in Appomattox. And, we could just go on just for April of all the events that ever happened there. But at a time whenever the stress and all that was on the shoulders of Abraham Lincoln for those 4 years of 61 through 65, and then all of a sudden to hear about Lee's surrender at Appomattox and knowing that the war was starting to wrap up, you think, my goodness, that for a few days that how he must have felt better. I mean, still, it wasn't finished yet, but it was wrapping up. I mean, we knew the writing was on the wall. It was going to end soon. And all of the stress that man had been under of reading about the horrific casualties of war, the economic stress, the military stress, and the own private stress of Abraham Lincoln that he endured during that time, and then to hear about Appomattox, and then at least for a few days, it would seem like that at least part of this heavy load would have been lifted over his shoulders, and then Of course, as we know, in those tragic days of April 14th and April 15th, his life ended. The nation, which had been literally just ripped apart for 4 years in a terrible civil war, then all of a sudden they had to endure the death of their president. So the Lincoln funeral train, the story that we're talking about today, this was an opportunity for people to show their appreciation, I guess, in a number of ways. Even though he was a deceased president, it was a way of them to honor the president, and for at least a few states and for several thousand people during this time then, the Lincoln funeral train in April of 1865 was the most important event, at least for a few days, wasn't it?
Yes. It was a country in mourning, and it gave the people a chance to express that mourning directly. We had many local, whatever you want to say, memorial services, but the train gave the chance for people to be in mass and to get one last look at the coffin of the great president.
You know, and it's a thing, you know, that, of course, some people actually got to go to the viewing of President Lincoln. It happened in Annapolis, it happened in other places. But even the chance, the opportunity to see the train coming by, that I've read accounts where people would wait for hours, sometimes in pouring rain, and this would have been a very cold rain in April, that they would wait for hours just for a chance to even to glimpse the train as it went by. This meant a lot to the people. And it should. You know, folks, we're coming up, we're doing this taping in 2012, but right in this particular time period, we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and I think about the 2012, all the things that happened there, the Battle of Antietam and so forth, and then we're going on next year, which would be the Battle of Gettysburg. But in 2015, there'll be the 150th anniversary of the Lincoln funeral train coming through this state, and I'm hoping that we can get jump started maybe through this program and thinking, okay, well, let's do some things to look at our history, to preserve our history, and to celebrate this time.
Yes. As a matter of fact, I have recently talked to a gentleman who is trying to organize a reenactment of that funeral train in 2015. Yeah. And he's hoping to actually bring it through Indiana if he gets it all together, which he's in the process of doing now, getting the train together. Oh,
and I'm hoping he does, and we'll certainly give all the support that we can to him, because we want this to be something that's successful for him. Before we get into showing the Lincoln funeral train, we've been very fortunate that even though the photography was in its early stages, but still, we have some good shots of the Lincoln train. We're going to get to that in just a second. But there was someone else that was on the train with Lincoln as it started this journey, Willie. And I think we have a picture of Willie up there. Willie also was on the train. And again, of all the pressure on this Lincoln, is just unimaginable, the stress on Lincoln throughout these 4 years. But then he loses his son, Willie. Do you know anything, you know, that a lot of people probably they know about Willie, but he died not too many days or a short period of time before Lincoln himself.
Actually, it was about a year before Lincoln. He had been interned in a Washington cemetery. Well, plans had always been for the Lincolns to uninter him, to bring his body back to Illinois upon returning. So one of the first things that Mary Lincoln and Robert Lincoln made sure is that Willie's casket would be removed from the Washington Cemetery and would ride the train with his father.
Yeah, so whenever we talk about the Lincoln train carrying the body of our great president, we want to keep in mind that also his son, his young son, also made this journey with him. And I don't remember, about how old was he? Was he around 9, 10? Do you remember, Diana?
Somewhere in that area, 8 or 9, yeah.
Yeah, he was so young, and again, it's been a while since I've read about him, about what he died of, but he was very young.
Yeah, he died, and I'm not sure whether it was cholera or something very similar. It was a lung-type infection, viral infection.
So if you didn't have anything else going on in your life, Jim, just the fact that you lose your son like that would be enough to, the burden on yourself would have been tremendous.
Lincoln would go to that room where he died numerous times during the week and sit and cry.
Yeah. You just made, and you know, Diana, on you know, from a standpoint of you, you can kind of feel for what Mary would have gone through in that too, right?
Yes, and see, Oliver and Lucinda had 5 children. They had 3 boys and 2 girls, and they lost both of the girls before they turned 1. Within their first year, they lost both the girls.
Oh, okay. So they could have identified with what the Lincolns were going through during that time with the personal loss. We have a picture of the route of the funeral train. Jim, and I want to thank you for sending the book that you did to help me to get prepared for these shows. But let's the map that we have out there, the route that we have out for the people to see right now. We're actually let's kind of go. I always thought at one time that it was the route that he took from Springfield to Washington, D.C., and I think a lot of people were under that false assumption, but that's not the case, is it?
No, it's not the case. There were some definite changes made due for 2 reasons. Number one, Pittsburgh was left off the route. It was on the original route because they wanted to get the train to go as fast as it could and still give people time to value the train. Secretary of War Stanton had worked out a routing that he felt would get the body to Springfield within approximately 10 days, but still give viewing chance. So therefore, he cut out Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was a little upset at that, but they were cut out. Also, Cincinnati was cut out because Cincinnati had been the hotbed of what we call Copperheads, which is Southern sympathizers who lived in the North.
Yeah.
It had been a hotbed of that, and he was afraid that if the body was taken there, that there may be some kind of disruption to the train, maybe possibly somebody trying to steal the body of Lincoln. So he on purpose avoided Cincinnati.
And if you think today, folks, that this is far-fetched that somebody would actually steal a body of Lincoln, actually they did later on try to steal the body of Lincoln. So this wasn't as far-fetched as it seems. Yeah,
that's true.
And you know, if we're talking about the car wreck, you can imagine that you have this tremendous act going on of the funeral train coming through, and then someone sabotaging the tracks and derailing the train or something. That and this would have been a genuine fear. I mean, it happened in the Civil War during this time period. I mean, they did sabotage the train. They did with the tracks. This was a common event. So this would have been a very plausible fear, wouldn't it?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. We have the route then started where then, Jim?
It starts in Washington, D.C. and goes towards Baltimore. And then from Baltimore, it goes to the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. From Harrisburg, it goes to Philadelphia. And then it goes up through New York City, basically across Albany to Buffalo, Buffalo to Cleveland, Cleveland to Columbus, Columbus to Indianapolis, Indianapolis to Chicago, Chicago, Springfield, basically.
Right. So, you know, again, we had already mentioned, Jim, that it didn't retrace the route, but it seems to me that they were wanting to hit the capitals as much as they could, the principal large cities, and that this is what they were doing on the route. Is that right?
Yes.
So you're going to see that, folks, when we get into the Indiana part, that of course the state of Indiana is very prominent in the route. Now there were other people that wanted the route. You can imagine. I read in the book that St. Louis was really pitching to try to get the train over that way. I mean, there was a lot of people that would have loved, not in the southern part of our states, but in the northern part, there would have been a lot of people that would have loved to have the train come through.
Boston even wanted to know why it wasn't brought to Boston, a very important area for the emancipation type movement. And of course, that would have been very impossible. You would have had to gone up to Boston, would have added another 2 to 3 days on the trip. St. Louis would have added another day. We're talking about 14, 15 days in a period of time when we don't have refrigerated cars to keep the body refrigerated. We don't have all the modern type of embalming. It would have just been literally impossible.
Yeah, and so, and you're, even though, fortunately, it's a cooler time of the year, that this didn't happen in July or something, or it would have been even greater, but still, that this would have been a real issue. When I look at the route, again, going through Pennsylvania, New York, I was just in New York recently, in Irvington, Tarrytown area, and saw probably where the train would have gone through and have traced it there. And even though it's about in Indiana today, the funeral train, we still wanted to mention about the other place that it went through. We've been very lucky that we actually have found some pictures of the train itself, what it looked like, and so we're going to kind of show you a few of those. The first one coming up, this is a fantastic, I believe that, Jim, this is somewhere near the Chicago area, but this is one of the best pictures I've seen of the train itself because, again, you get to see as many of the cars as you possibly can.
Yeah, that's the Chicago Causeway along the edge of the Michigan River. Lake Michigan.
Lake Michigan, yes, and it is fantastic because when you look closely at this photo here, not only can you see many of the cars, but the reflection of the train in the water, and I kind of like that as well. We're going to talk about the train a little bit more in detail, but this is a great shot. Well, the next shot, this one in Chicago, and look at this. This is, again, I like this because not only do you get to see the train car that Lincoln was actually carried in, but look at the soldiers outside there, and so I think that also plays a great role in this picture as well. But again, and this is a close-up of the train car itself.
Yeah, there's a little history to that car. The car is called the United States car. Actually, Lincoln had to take public transportation when he went to Gettysburg. Well, Secretary of War Stanton said, hey, we can't have our president riding around on a public train car. So when he got back from Gettysburg, Stanton had the War Department build this car. It was built in Alexandria, Virginia. It was built especially to carry the president and other dignitaries of the United States. It was a very luscious car that had never been used until it was time for the funeral train. They brought it out of, they remodeled it slightly so that it could handle the caskets of Lincoln and Willie, Abraham and Lily. But it was a very luscious car, and after it was brought back to Washington after the funeral, it was decided to be sold because they decided that no other president should ever ride in it again. So here was a car built specifically for a president, but was used only one time as far as the government was concerned, and that was for the funeral train.
Yeah, and so Lincoln got to use it, but he never knew he was. I mean, he was already gone by that time. But it would have been a great car to see, and this is a great shot of there. Okay, I think we have another one, maybe that's coming up, and. Here it comes. Yeah, and I love this photo again because again I believe oh boy, and I'm kind of rusty on when this shot was taken, but it was before it reached the state of Indiana, I know. But I like this one because again it has Lincoln's picture right there on the front of the engine there. And this is a great one, in fact, too. And there were several taken that during this time. We couldn't possibly give you all the pictures of the train, but again, this is a great shot of the engine. Okay, we'll see if we have another one here on the Lincoln funeral train. No, not that's it on the train itself. Let me ask you then, Jim, on the train is the. Again, we're in the midst of the war. Edwin Stanton was involved in the process. He was the head of this, right? Yes. So Secretary Stanton, which had the responsibility of this, but this is something that had to be put together real quick. It had to be, I mean, it couldn't be something that could be planned over, you could spend months in the process of planning a funeral of this magnitude, but it had to be put together quick. And he had a war going on.
Yes. Yeah. Why some people might say, why is the Secretary of War handling this? At this time, all Union railroads were under the United States government military railroad. It didn't matter whether it was the New York Central or the short run here in Indiana called the Columbus to Indiana run. It didn't matter. Each of those were officially under the War Department to be used for the Army, and so therefore this is why he, as Secretary of War, had control over it. And he planned out the route, but he handed it over to Adjutant General underneath him to take care of the train itself and to run the train, and told him to report back at every station stop that the train was on hand. But officially it was under the War Department.
This would have been a 24/7 type of, during this time period to get this ready. I mean, there were all kinds of problems with logistics and so forth that you would have seen going through the geographical part of it alone, but something of this magnitude you think of in the short time they did a great job, by the way, I think. Yeah. But also the family of Lincoln, which it would have been involved prominently in the in the process of the funeral. With Mary Lincoln, there wasn't am I fair to say this or not fair? A lot of cooperation with this? I mean, is that fair, Diana? To say there wasn't the cooperation, or that, I can understand. I mean, the woman had to be in shock. I mean, she just saw just a few days earlier her husband get shot in the head. I mean, anybody would not be in the right mind. But she had very specific ideas of what should be done about the funeral.
She did, and her main feeling was that they were taking all her control away. She really didn't have a lot of say into what was done and how he was transported or where he was going, and it was just kind of, we'll take care of it, you just mourn. And but she did finally give in for him to go to Springfield to be.
Yeah,
but there was some more issues on that too, yes.
Right, yeah. We last night, the Gosserts and my wife and I, we fought the Battle of Golden Corral last night and inside, and I don't know who won on that one, but Jim, we talked about this, that initially she wanted Lincoln to be buried in Chicago. Is that correct?
What happened in this case, first of all, there was talk about burying him in Washington. She refused. She said Washington had not welcomed her or Lincoln to what she felt. So she didn't want him buried in Washington. Immediately, Springfield said, no, he belongs to us, and started making the assumption that he was going to go there. Well, this upset Mary. She said, well, no, I'll bury him in Chicago. If you're going to assume that we're going to bring him to Springfield, I'll bury him in Chicago. And she, for a while, talked about Chicago. Finally, she relented and said, okay, the body will be taken to Springfield. But that in turn also brought up another problem, because Springfield decided, well, we'll make a mausoleum to him. And she said, no, I want him buried at Oak Hill Cemetery. They said, no, we want to make this big mausoleum. She said, you build that big mausoleum, I'm going to bury him in Chicago. And so finally they backed up on the mausoleum and let him be buried in Oak Hill Cemetery.
Yeah, so it wasn't as easy as it seemed. They actually, I believe you told me last night that it actually got started just a few days before here, and then they had to suspend it. And actually, folks, that Lincoln actually wasn't buried in this mausoleum until 1901. So he never got any rest in that way, for a while yet. The train itself, which fortunately the Union, the northern states had a great railway system, but again, putting this kind of train together, this kind of funeral together at this time. Actually, how many cars, I know that was actually used at the beginning for the funeral train itself?
Stanton specified that no more than 9 cars were to be used. That would be cars for the group of escorts. That would include the United States car, which is the president. There would be escorts cars. There would be baggage cars, and then, as necessary, there would be sleeping cars and arrangement cars. But in his specifications, it was not to be more than 9 cars.
So it kind of get a feeling. Then we got to see a shot of some of the cars on the Lincoln train. But of course, you have the engine, and then behind you have then what was it? I don't remember exactly the order of the cars, but yet the Lincoln car carrying Lincoln and his son himself was the next to the last car.
It was either the next to last car or last car, depending on where. Okay. And that was for ease of removing the coffin at the designated stops. So they wouldn't have to uncouple all the cars to get to a car like in the middle or the front. They could simply uncouple the United States from the train and then let the train go on. And then they would have the uncoupled car where they could maneuver the casket in and out.
Makes sense. And since we kind of mentioned about the casket, the coffin of Abraham Lincoln, there was giving very specific orders not to do what this photograph did, right?
That is correct.
What we're seeing is the only known photograph taken of Abraham Lincoln that during this time period, and this wasn't supposed to have happened, right?
That is correct. Mary Lincoln very clearly specified to Secretary of War Stanton that no photographs were to be taken because her husband might look bad in those photographs. He might be deteriorated. So what happened is the gentleman you see on the left hand there is Adjutant General Townsend, Edward Townsend. He was made to be head of the train. He was the man who was appointed by Stanton to report at every stop. Well, he got to New York, and this photographer said, oh, let's take this picture. I want to take a picture. By the way, they did very well at standing still, because I understand that photograph took about 3 minutes to expose.
About 3 minutes of standing still like that, so that's an eternity when you have to stand for a picture like that.
And what happened was Stanton got word that this photograph was taken, and all heck broke loose. He
so
said,
the good general got in trouble?
Yes, he did. Stanton said, I want all the glass plates and I want all the prints of that picture. They're going to be destroyed. Well, the general responded back that it was all his fault, that is he in the photograph. He thought that the gentleman was 30 feet away or so. You can't see the president's face in it, so he thought it would be okay as a good remembrance of the occasion. Well, Stanton didn't take it for that. He basically said, no more of this, don't do it again. Send me all this, and as far as we know, all the prints were supposedly destroyed, but this print appeared in Stanton's private files later on in history, after Stanton had passed away, and it was found later on in his files. So,
so he kept it for I guess historical sake. I don't know why he kept it, but I'm glad he did, because we did get this great shot here. But again, I can understand why the family would have been upset. Dinah, did Mary Lincoln really actually, did she want a big public display like this, a funeral?
No,
the funeral?
No, she did not. She just wanted to have her own time to mourn and to have a family mourning. She didn't want to have the big affair that they had everywhere they stopped. Of course, she was not on the train. She did not ride the train.
She never did get on the train, is that correct? I mean, did Robert ever get on the train?
Yes.
No.
Didn't he ride it for a short period?
Well, okay, he did.
He actually was on the train, but
he got off. He rode the first leg to Baltimore, then he returned to Washington. He caught a train out of Washington to be at the funeral site in Springfield, but he never rode on the train itself.
Okay.
Past that initial Baltimore run.
Okay, so he was briefly just on the train then, and but as far as we know, then Mary Lincoln never.
Mary was not even at the funeral. Mary was not at the entombment in Springfield. She was still in the White House, and President Johnson at this time was cordial enough to stay in his hotel room and let Mary have the necessary time for mourning.
Okay. So and who we're talking about, Robert, of course, is the son of Abraham Lincoln, Robert Lincoln, and which would have briefly been on train. So who would have actually, I know there were a lot of people at different stops that entered and left the train and all that, but who normally would have been on the train then, Jim?
Normally on the train would have been the governor from the state in which the train was in, plus also 4 of us governors were invited, including myself, Governor Morton, was invited to ride the train the whole length. Now, there's some discrepancy whether Morton did or did not do that. We know he was on the train when he left Washington. There's some indication he might have come back with Robert. There's some indication he may have rode to Cleveland and then met the train again. We know he was on the train when it left, and we know he was on the train when it was in Indiana.
Yeah,
in between, we're not sure.
Yeah, we do know that, and I kept running into that problem too, where Governor Morton was at, and I thought, well, there's not 2 Governor Mortons out there running around, but it seemed like he was out east, but then he was in Indiana. So, but we do know for sure, folks, that he was on it from the entire route of Indiana, right?
Yes. Yeah. And we know he was on it at least in Washington to Baltimore.
Okay.
We know those 2 areas he definitely was on. Where else, we're not sure.
Okay.
And as I was saying, each state has the governor who is in care of the train directly, and also on those trains are a group of the pallbearers. They're the
Veteran
Reserve Guard. They're made up of Union men who had been wounded during the war or had been some kind of other inferior, either pneumonia or something that now made them incapacitated for fighting, but they were stationed in Washington. All those 29 men came from that group, and Indiana did have 1 man to serve in that guard, and they were going to be the honorary, their pallbearers and the honorary guard throughout the train. They rode the complete route, and also whoever the citizens of the upcoming city would usually get on before. In other words, the people for Baltimore got on in Washington, the people for Harrisburg would get on in Baltimore, and so forth. And so the Indianapolis representatives actually got on just before Richmond.
So we would have had an assortment of important people at the time get on there, as senators, Congressman, and I understand that there were African Americans that was on the train at one time. Frederick Douglass was actually on the train for a brief period of time, but no women were allowed on the train at this specific time, and we're going to talk about that when we get to Indiana. But yet, no women were allowed on the train. Is that correct?
They could, at stops, they were allowed to come on, place wreaths and flowers on the casket, but they were not allowed to ride on the train.
Yeah, and the reason for this?
Because the train was going to overnight, and you'd have men and women riding overnight on the train, and that was a no-no.
No, especially on a presidential funeral train, that I can understand that. It was kind of interesting, Jim, that the train, I read in the good book that you gave me, and what was the title of that book? Was it called The Lincoln Funeral Train?
Yeah. Lincoln Funeral.
Excellent book, and I'd recommend it for you folks out there.
By Still, his name, the author is Still.
Yeah, and by the way, that Jim, you had communication with the author then, and you said he was a really great guy to work with, answered your questions, and so I want to say kudos to that. But if you folks want to read more about this program, and hopefully we're getting some interest stirred in you, is that you can read The Lincoln Funeral Train, and excellent book. And who is the author of this book?
Still, and I can't remember his first name.
Okay. And you'll be able to find it on Amazon, I know, and various places. So it's an extremely extensive work done on the Lincoln Funeral Train, so well worth your reading. But he was very helpful to you, and he had done a lot of research on the subject. And I noticed that he said that the fuel had, of course, the train had to stop every 80 miles. It just seems so, I know that today to think, well, you'd have to stop every 80 miles, you're not going to make any time. But given the time, it was a pretty good run. But it would have to stop for fuel and water and wood about every 80 miles. And it was chugging along at the horrific tremendous speed of 20 miles per hour. This was moving.
Yeah, it was actually a little slower than a normal train, because a normal train would run around 40 miles an hour, but a normal train would be only about 4 cars. So Stanton said safe speed would be about 20 miles an hour with these 9 cars.
Okay. Yeah, and I was interested in the book. It would be great to be able to just spend some time on trains during that time and to study that. But every car had to have its own brake system, right? So you're going to have some pretty I mean, if the people in trains in the cars 2, 3, 4, and 5 was doing their job, but you had 7 and 8 was fast asleep down there, you've got a problem in applying the brakes during this time.
Yeah, the brakes are applied from the top. It's a wheel circle brake, and you had a brakeman on each brake. And what he did is he rode up there, and when the train gave the correct signal, he would start braking.
So it was the signal came from the engine, and
it would
some
be
kind of a
whistle. It would be a set whistle blow, and that means start braking. And if it was an emergency brake, it'd be a different whistle. One type of whistle would be a slow brake, and an emergency brake would be a different type of whistle.
Well, you can imagine, again, the problems of going through the mountains and some areas here that they would have encountered in this. But this would have had to have been well coordinated. But these were people, I'm assuming they would have got the best at that time to be on this, to be able to coordinate that effort.
Yeah, each railroad that was used along the way had their best engineers, their best firemen, and their best brakemen dedicated to this train.
Along the route, I know at the beginning that they know that there would have been people that wanted to, especially at the cities, there would have been planned stops and displays of mourning. Now keep in mind, folks, that they didn't have a lot of time to put these morning sessions together. They didn't have a lot of time to put all this. This was happening pretty quick. But again, I don't think they would have even realized the extent of the outpouring of grief and mourning that would have encountered along the small towns, the little villages that this would have gone through.
This amazed Townsend, General Townsend. He sent back messages to Stanton. He says, you can't believe what we're getting. We have bonfires every night. We have torches every night. You go through farmers who aren't even near a town, and they've got a group of farmers together by the railroad track in between cities. It was just a massive outpouring of filling for the president.
And this would have been something to see if you'd been on the train, and the darkness of night, to be approaching, some little village and then see all the fires lit up, and this would have been a great thing to see, wouldn't it?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, many engineers said that they didn't they lit the train light, but they really didn't need it because it was total bonfire between the 20 miles between a town. just nothing but bonfires, and the bonfires lit the road. They didn't really need to have their headlights.
That's amazing. That is just simply amazing. Along the route, then, they would stop at not only the place, we're going to get into the morning part of it here in just a moment, but they would have had to stop for to get some food on it. I mean, there would have been, on the train itself, they didn't have it. They may have had a dining car. Well, they didn't really have a dining car per se. I mean, so they had to stop to go eat lunch and supper and that type of thing.
Yeah, this time there weren't dining cars as we knew it. Some trains would run what they called a breakfast car. That simply was a car that had benches set up around, and they would stop and they would bring on the food and then take off the train again. But most of them actually would stop at little restaurants, or what they called restaurants. They're more like whistle stop type things that you'd go in and get a real fast little meal, and that would be it. And so they had breakfast planned, and they had notified the breakfast stops and the dinner stops. We will be here for breakfast, and we expect you to have it ready so that we can meet the schedule, like a 20-minute stop for breakfast. That would be it. And they would have a dinner stop for, well, dinner, of course, at this time is in the noonday meal. We need to explain that to modern-day people. Dinner is noon.
Good point.
Supper is what you eat at night. And dinner is your main meal. So they would arrange for dinner stops that would be about 45 minutes to an hour, because that was their main meal. Then they would have dinner. Now, many times dinner came at the end of the run when they would get to a big town like Columbus or something. A lot of those ended up at night. Or the breakfast stop, to be truthful with you, Indianapolis was a breakfast stop because they got here at 7 in the morning. So they stopped here, had their breakfast here in Indiana before proceeding.
So at any given time on the train, about how many people would you think, just estimate, would have been on the train? I know you have the 29 men, the veteran reserve guard of escort and all that. But
I've heard that some of the runs were some of the in-between runs were as many as 75 to 100. The last run out of Chicago, which contained many people, actually took 2 extra trains that left early. They left at 7 and 7:30 because they had close to 500, 600 dignitaries that had already gathered in Chicago to make the last run of the train.
And you can understand that what it would have been like to have been able to pick just to been on the train. That would have been a fantastic opportunity there. We have some pictures of mourning, of the way the people, again, they had to act pretty quick to put some of these things together, but some of these things are very elaborate. The first one it has is an arch that was put up. We're going to see something, I can't remember exactly where this was at. I know I have one of Michigan City, and the one in Michigan City was very similar to that. I'm not for sure that this is one in Michigan City, but anyway, the funeral car itself would have pulled underneath this arch, right? And so this would have been, this arch would have been over Lincoln himself. Is that correct?
Most of the time, yes. These were arches put across the railroad. A couple of them had a problem. When they got to the arch was too narrow for the train to go by, and they had to actually get out and take the arch down for the train to process.
Oh, okay.
A couple of them, they made them just a little too tight for the train to get through.
Well, again, you can understand why they would have had problems like that, because they had to throw these together. This one is one of my wife insisted that I put on this show is the Goddess of Liberty, and the Goddess of Liberty. This was a common seen throughout the route. Is that right, Jim?
Yes. There would be either pictures on display, or some areas actually had living actors and actors doing this. They would actually have a lady dressed in white over a coffin with the representing the Goddess of Liberty crying. They would actually do this on the side of the road as the train came by.
Okay. So, Diana, I'm going to ask you to give Jim a little bit of a break here. You are familiar with how people would have mourned during this time period. What would have been the typical way that people, along the train route, that people would have expressed their mourning during this time?
Well, to start with, there's 3 stages of mourning during this time. One is called heavy mourning, which is what Mary's doing at this time. She's withdrawn. She's not taking any visitors. She's dressed completely in black, and she's just by herself and immediate family. Where then that she would probably be in that for about a year or longer. And after that, there's full mourning. At full mourning, you receive guests, and you're still in black. You can start wearing jewelry. Your black outfits may be trimmed in like a deep purple or something like that. During this time, since the president was not an immediate family member, most of the people along this route are in what's called half mourning, and they would wear white dresses trimmed in black, or your deeper colored outfits like what I'm wearing now with a black trim. And that would show that they are in mourning, but it wasn't an immediate family member, or it was later on after they had passed. Maybe it could be about 2 years, 2.5 years or so. For this, though, since it wasn't an immediate family member, mourning could go from 3 months to 3 weeks or whatever. It just depends on the relationship you have with the person.
So along the route then, this would have been a familiar theme probably to those up on the train then, the people that dressed in this fashion that you're talking about in the
Right,
various
they'd be in
morning.
they could be in the deeper colors like what I have on with the dark trim, or the white with a dark trim. Babies, when they've lost their parents or whatever, they would be in white with black trim. And the ladies would come in and they'd have a lot of flowers, wreaths, crosses made out of flowers. They'd use roses, calla lilies, passion flowers, and any type of dainty white flowers that they could find. And
yeah, and it seems strange to us now because we think, oh, this should have been black in mourning, but it was white. But again, that would be kind of confusing to people, wouldn't it?
right, and it just mainly depended on the stage of mourning, and again, like I said, the relationship the person has with the deceased.
There would have been, and we're running out of time for this first show, folks. Like I mentioned, we're going to have 2 shows, so you're going to get to see the second show a little bit later. But yet, we do know that they had the, and thanks to Diana for explaining that, because people are going to find that interesting. But we had these arches like that we showed to you. It would have been typical to have 36-gun salutes, again representing the state.
And also what they call minute guns. Those are a gun, a muffled cannon being shot every minute.
Okay.
And that's called a minute gun. That becomes confusing when people say minute gun. Are they shooting a rifle every minute? No, it would be a muffled cannon. So it would not be a big bang. It would be more like a boom type. Okay. And they'd go off every minute. They would be shot off every minute. Okay. And that is done for a person of high esteem during their funeral.
So this was a common thing. Then the gun salutes, anything representing the 36 stars. This would have been noticing here. So you had all these different kind of displays, folks. We are just we've gone through this hour, and it went by really quick because there is so much interesting stuff here, and we haven't even got to the state of Indiana. But next show we will be in Indiana. So we are approaching Indiana, and to us that's very important because we're doing the show, the funeral train as it came through Indiana. And so I promise you on the next show that's where we're going to be discussing the funeral train in Indiana. Jim, thank you. We've got part 1 done, my friend, and Diana, thank you. And we want you to stay true because you don't want to miss the second show of the Lincoln funeral train when it came through Indiana in 1865. You've been watching the Indiana History Project. I'm your host, Norm Taylor. Thank you for watching. We'll see you for part 2.